Our reading from Rays of the One Light this week is on self-reliance versus self-reliance. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Last week we considered the need for attunement with God, with the gurus, with the wisdom of others, until we make that wisdom our own. There is a strong and in fact valid belief nowadays in the need for standing on one's own 2 feet, rather than depending weakly on others to carry us by their strength. Swami Kriyananda was once asked, "What is the best yoga posture?" "That one," he replied, "which sets you squarely on your own 2 feet." Our strength must come from within. If that strength comes from the ego, however, instead of from soul consciousness, it is like a guitar string without its sounding board. The notes that it emits will be thin and feeble. Our strength must come from within, but it must be coupled with the recognition of our own inner link with broader and higher realities. The Bhagavad Gita says in the 10th chapter, "Everyone in this world whose life is glorious, or prosperous, or powerful, know that his achievement is but a little spark from the great sun of my effulgence." Jesus, in talking with his disciples, emphasized also the power of attunement with his own consciousness, a ray of the divine. For this ray had descended already through him in response to their devotion. It was a sign that God was already listening to them with receptive attention and did not require to be wooed in that way any longer. In the passage preceding the one that we read last week, Jesus said, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeseth, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now you are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except ye abide in me." This was also the meaning of Paramhansa Yogananda's counsel also, when speaking more intimately with the disciples of the need for attunement with him. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. I'm going to start this morning with a story. And this is a story about a great sage who lived a very simple life in a village in India. He was married, lived with his wife and his daughter and son. And the sage didn't want others to really know about his high spiritual attainments. And so he sort of feigned this worldly veneer so that others would not realize who he really was. And in time, his son developed a great yearning for the spiritual life. And despite his father's entreaties to stay there in the village, he decided to go off to the Himalayas to seek a guru. And while he was there, he found a Tibetan miracle man and spent 20 years studying with this man. And he lived as an ascetic. He practiced great austerities, very simple life, and he developed a number of powers. And after 20 years, he came back to his village, and the village was all abuzz because he was very sort of puffed up with himself and very happy to share his village friends all of his wonderful attainments, powers. And his father heard about this, and so he sent for his son. And when the two of them met, he greeted his son, and his son just couldn't help but, sort of brag about all of the stuff that he could do. And so his father said, "Okay, well, tell me what you can do." And the son says, "I'll tell you what I can do." And they walk out to the river Ganges, and his son walks across the water to the other bank and back without getting his feet wet. And his father's face turned very grave. He had been smiling, but he became very grave. And the son's like, "What's wrong, Father?" And his father said, "For a long time I was very happy for you because I thought that you were doing something very worthwhile with your life. But now I see that's not the case." And his son got kind of irritated. "What do you mean?" And he says, "Well, I see you have spent 20 years developing the power to walk across water, something which we can do by paying a ferryman 4 cents. Why on earth did you waste 20 years learning how to walk across water to save 4 cents? And the son sort of bowed his head and his spell of pride began to break. And then the father went on and he said, "To love powers, to love great miracles more than to love the source of all miracles and the power of continuous God contact is foolishness." And so the son then bowed his head and realized the error that he had made. Our reading this morning talks about the importance of our strength coming from within, not from the ego, but from soul consciousness and this attunement to broader and higher realities. And I want to read a quote from the autobiography of a yogi. This is from chapter 26 on the science of Kriya Yoga, where Yogananda says, "Identifying himself with a shallow ego, man takes for granted that it is he who thinks, wills, feels, digests meals, and keeps himself alive, never admitting through reflection, only a little would suffice, that in his ordinary life he is not but a puppet of past actions, karma, and of nature or environment. Lofty above such influences, however, is his regal soul." And then he goes on to talk about how by Kriya we have a method to prove this scriptural truth. And as I was reflecting on this topic, it just strikes me how very important, particularly for us here in America, is this point about not identifying with the ego, but tuning into these broader and higher realities. And we have in this country this cultural myth around this idea that I'll call rugged individualism. It was a term that President Herbert Hoover sort of made famous in a speech that he gave. And I remember sort of learning about this in high school. It was that spirit of pioneerism that was coupled with the Western expansion movement in the 1800s, and then got subsumed by the Industrial Revolution and the growth of wealth and materialism in this country. And I'm not saying that putting out energy and standing on our own 2 feet isn't a good thing. It is, yes. But so often in this country, we see that in a very short-sighted way, rooted in the ego, rather than these broader and higher realities. And just as an example, sort of a silly example of this, I was thinking, there was this cartoon that was on when I was a kid called He-Man and Masters of the Universe. Maybe I'm dating myself a bit here, but the protagonist is this very blonde white male who discovers that he has this magic sword, and he lifts it and he says, "I have the power!" And then magical things happen and he becomes the most powerful man in the universe. And, it's laughable in a sense, yes, but, it's also like this is stuff we're feeding to our kids, right? Like, it's very representative of this cultural ethos that we have around wanting to be powerful and wanting to look good and all of that. And yet, look back over the last 100 years, and how many powerful, wealthy, famous people can you think of that were truly happy, that had inner peace? I can think of one very quickly, but only one. Rajarsi Janakananda. And that was because he was a master. He had mastered his ego and become a saint. Yogananda used to say to him, remember, Rajarsi, where your power comes from. And Rajarsi would answer in a very humble, childlike way, yes, I know, Master, it comes from you. Right? He knew where his true wealth came from. The song we sang this morning, if you're seeking freedom, you're not going to find it in a revolution, in a marble mansion, or on a throne of power, right? Power and money very often are traps that the ego uses to keep us bound by in the little self, in the little egoic self. And there are others too. The intellect is another big one. And it's something that I think historically in the U.S. has also been something valued in this country. I doubt it. I'm questioning that a little bit right now, given what's happened in recent years. But we have this belief that we can reason our way out of our delusions if we just think ourselves in the right directions. And I used to think this myself as well. I was blessed to have a good mind and be pretty smart in school, and I thought that my mind would get me through anything. And then at a certain point in my spiritual life, I realized that I could logically argue my way to two completely opposite conclusions. And this happened on multiple occasions, and I finally realized that I could not trust my mind in matters of the spirit. So how do we know whether we're relying on our little egoic self with a small s or our bigger divine self with a large S? Our reading today emphasized attunement as one of the ways to help us. And I'm just going to read the end of that Bible passage that was in today's reading. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except ye abide in me. Through Yogananda, and then it went on to say that Yogananda emphasized attunement with his disciples to attune themselves to him. And it's through that attunement that he could help them on subtle levels to receive and recognize divine guidance, to develop intuition and discernment, and gradually to begin to release the hold of the ego and trust and follow that divine guidance. And as we deepen our attunement with Master, with this ray, we also begin to be transformed in that same way. Last week, Dharmadas and Nirmala spoke about abiding in God and the importance of attunement to that. And the importance of maintaining that awareness of our connection with Spirit and keeping that open, staying centered, staying in our spine, because when we are in that place, then we can better discriminate whether something is coming from the ego or from one of these broader and higher realities, right? It was so wonderful that Swami paired this affirmation on discrimination with the reading this morning. And true discrimination comes not from reasoning, not from the intellect, but soul intuition. And that we have to ask God to help guide our understanding. the Gita passage this morning. Everyone in this world whose life is glorious or prosperous or powerful, know that his achievement is but a little spark from the great sun of my effulgence. Right? The more we can abide in God, the more we can stay in tune, the more that power can flow through us, and the more we can reflect that in our lives. And we talked about discernment. It's interesting. I went and looked at this chapter in the Gita. It's chapter 10. Just a little bit earlier, Krishna actually tells Arjuna how to develop discernment. He says, "To those who are attached only to me and who worship me with love, I impart that discernment of wisdom by which they attain me completely. Out of pure compassion, I, the Divine One who dwells in all, set alight in their hearts the blazing lamp of wisdom which banishes their darkness of ignorance." So when we're attached and love God wholeheartedly, He imparts that discernment, that wisdom to us, and then we can tell much more clearly what's of God, what's of the ego. And, I'll say, having sort of worked with both of these things, that it's much more fun when God's working through you. And when I have a project and that I'm doing, and if I'm trying to muscle my way through it or trying to intellectualize my way through it, just to kind of like get it done, get it off my plate, it is such a slog. It really is. And in contrast, when I can just sort of like take a step back and say, "Okay, Master, Divine Mother, I need your help with this, please. Show me what has to happen here. Inspire what I'm doing." It just becomes this lovely creative, co-creative process. And it's so much more fun. And it turns out so much better in the end. A few weeks ago, Dharmadas mentioned a scene at the end of the first Star Wars movie, Episode 4. And at the time, I thought, well, why didn't you mention this part? But I'm actually glad you didn't, because now I can bring it up. And this is the scene, remember, where Luke Skywalker is in his X-Wing fighter, and he's going to shoot the missile or the torpedo or whatever that's going to destroy the Death Star. And Darth Vader kind of gets on his tail and locks him in. He's like, "I've got you now." Until Han Solo sweeps in and sends his little spaceship careening off into space. So that's the part that Dharmadas talked about. There's something else happening in this scene that's very relevant to our conversation this morning. And that is that as Luke pulls out his little viewfinder to lock in on where he needs to shoot to destroy the Death Star, he hears Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice. I'll say, first of all, the only reason he hears it is because of his attunement, right? If he wasn't attuned, he wouldn't have heard it. But he had some degree of attunement. And Obi-Wan says to him, "Use the Force, Luke. Let go." Use the Force, Luke. Right? Trust God to flow through you. You don't need this little viewfinder thing. Put it away, focus, get in your spine, and let go. Why let go? Because so often when we're in our ego, there's tension, right? We're trying to control something, or we're tense, and the divine can't flow through us when we have that tension. And so Luke hears this, and he sort of turns his head away from the viewfinder. But then you can tell he sort of second guesses that, right? Because he's been trained, he's got to use this thing, right? So he goes back to look into it, and he hears Obi-Wan's voice again, and he says to him, Luke, trust me. Trust me. Right? Some of this working with God and letting the divine flow through you, right? We have to trust on a certain level that that's going to come. And that's a little challenging, oftentimes, especially in the beginning or with something really big. One image that I have found really helpful in my own life is sort of feeling that the masters have my back. Now, when I'm up here giving Sunday service, that's literally the case, right? They're all here. But even when I'm not, but I'm doing other things, just sort of feeling that and carrying that awareness with me. They're with me. They've got my back. I just need to tune in. And if we can start doing this with little things in our lives, then it becomes a little bit easier and not so much of a reach with the bigger things in our lives. So Luke hears this and he puts it away. And it's interesting. They flash a scene to the control center and they say, Luke, your computer's offline. Is everything okay? And he's like, yeah, it's fine. Right? But he's now in his center. It's fine. Right? And then Vader sort of spins off, and then he takes a moment and he focuses and he fires the shot and pulls out of there. Right? And then the next thing you see is the Death Star exploding into millions of little pieces. But there's one more very important scene that happens next. We flash back to Luke in his X-Wing fighter, and you see this sort of sigh of relief on his face, and you hear Obi-Wan once more. And Obi-Wan says, remember, the Force will be with you always. And we have to remember that too. The Force, God, Divine Mother, gurus, right, are with us already. Always. Yesterday, today, and forever. We have to trust that, and we have to let go and ask for that guidance to come and open ourselves up to let it flow through us. And the more we can do this, and the more we can abide in God, the more God's power can flow through us and spiritualize our efforts, and make even better whatever it is that we're doing. God bless you. So we'll have a chance now for an offering.